I done better this morning. I didn't run off down the hall to lock the doors. We're studying Ecclesiastes this morning. We'll be starting in chapter 3. We'll be beginning around verse 15. That's where we got to last Sunday morning, was verse 14. Greg discussed it, so we'll start in verse 15. It says, that which has already been and what is to be has already been. That which is has already been, and that which is to be has already been, and God requires an account of what is past. The first question, or the question 10 in our lesson, says, in what other verse in Ecclesiastes, and it's one that we've already studied, states the same truth as the first part of verse 15. It's Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 9. We'll turn over there right quick and read that. It says, that which has been is what will be, and that which is done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. So these are almost a complete repeat of each other, and I think that it's basically important that he's reminding us again that there's nothing new under the sun, that everything that's being done now has already been done, everything that's going to be done has already been done. I think the focus on that primarily has to do with is the continuing cycle of life. You know, we do the same things. We're born, we're raised by our parents or whoever, and then we mature and we get married and have children, and the cycle just keeps repeating itself. So he's telling us, as far as that kind of thing goes, there's nothing new under the sun. And as we talked some last time when we mentioned this in chapter 1, a lot of times we think we've invented maybe some grand new something, and that we may have developed sort of a new application for existing things that are here, but God created it all to begin with. The principles of physics and science still stand, so we're not really making anything new and different. We're not creating anything new. Whatever we're able to manage to figure out how to do with the materials that God's given us, the technology was already there. God had already created. So we're not doing anything truly unique, new, or different. We've just maybe figured out a different way to use something God has already created. And so I think something that helps us to realize there is that when you get down to it, we're not really incredibly special. We haven't really and truly done anything that God hadn't already known about to begin with, because God created to begin with. He made the technology to begin with, and we're finally now about 6,000 years able to figure some of it out. And so, you know, it's took us a long time, so we don't need to get real big-headed about the things we do, because, as it said in chapter 1, there's nothing new under the sun. Any questions or comments up to that point? Okay, the next question has to do with the last part of verse 15. It says, and God requires an account of what is past. To me, what that's telling me is that God's going to hold us in judgment for what we've done. You know, all the time we read about we're going to be judged for our deeds. Well, our deeds are in the past. I mean, the fact that I said our deeds in the past, that's in the past now. You know, I said it a few seconds ago, it's already my past. So everything that we're going to be judged for is the things that we've done. We're held accountable for what we've done. So when we think about things as we repeat our cycle of life from our birth up through our maturing and then our death, we're going to be held accountable for what we do during that time frame, whether it's good or bad. If we do good, we're taught that we're going to have a reward in heaven. And if we do bad, we're taught that we're going to have a reward in torment in hell. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to be thinking about that. Everything we go to do, we need to think, okay, what's the consequences, or what is going to be the outcome of my actions? And so we need to keep that constantly in mind. And as we talk about in the book of Ecclesiastes here, he's constantly going back and forth between things with just a physical outlook or a thing with an outlook including spiritual matters and God in it. And there's consequences for the things that we do physically, just in physical ways. If we behave well, if we work hard and make our money and earn our living and save money, then when we get old to where we can't, or whatever, to where we can't no work anymore, then we'll have something to go on there. We will have provided for ourselves as God's given us the ability. And if we don't do that, then we're going to have to do something different. We're going to struggle some. And so, but those physical outcomes we understand, but we need to also really focus on the spiritual outcomes of that. If we work hard in the kingdom, we do the things God would have us to do and perform well, then we're going to have that spiritual retirement, so to speak. We'll have that home in heaven forever, where we're taught that everything's going to be good. There won't be no more pain or sorrow or crying or anything like that. Everything will be good for us because we'll be there in the presence of God. So we need the things we do in our life, we need to understand there's a physical and a spiritual outlook, but the spiritual outlook of it is the most important part because it is eternal in nature. Physically, whatever I do, whatever I might build or construct or figure out or whatever is gonna go away. I might make some neat new thing. We might do some fencing down on the farm or something. Me and Josh done a little bit of that yesterday too. But sooner or later that fencing's going to be gone. And we know that because on our farm there's other places that somebody before us fenced, and the fence is all rusted down and rotted and got big gaps in it. It wouldn't keep nothing in. And so we know that whatever the works we do are going to eventually decay and rot away. So we need to understand that there's going to be a judgment. God's going to hold us account of what is past, it says here. And we need to understand that and live accordingly. I think we see a lot of places and a lot of people in the world that don't have any concept of judgment in mind, whether it's here on this earth in a physical court or whether it's standing before God in eternity in judgment. I don't think they have that in mind very much. They just go ahead and do what they want to and let the chips fall where they may. They don't worry about it. But we need to be, as a spiritual people, we need to have an eternal outlook about the things that we do. Let's see. Let's read the next few verses here. Moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. So as you read these two verses, the question here says, what frustrating problems did Solomon see in the areas of judgment or justice and righteousness? Well, in verse 16 he says, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. So what he's talking about here is in the physical realm, and we see that a lot in our world today. Me and Tina talk about it a good bit from time to time. We'll hear of something that somebody's done that's just incredibly wicked, and it seems like they're getting away with it because for whatever reason, our legal system doesn't pursue the matter the way we think it ought to. And we can all see examples of that happening, and we think of the great injustice in it and that there's wickedness there and not righteousness. But as it says in verse 17, it says, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. So when we get all concerned about the wickedness that's taking place in the world and the lack of judgment or justice that we see, we need to understand it's not our place to administer that justice. I think sometimes we think, well, I ought to take the vengeance. Well, the Bible tells us that vengeance belongs to God, so it's not our place to take vengeance. Under the law of Moses, if somebody murdered one of your relatives, you might be the one to be appointed the avenger of blood, and you were supposed to go hunt them down and kill them. And there were cities of refuge this person that had killed somebody could go to in order to get a trial in the matter. And they had to stay there until that was settled, and then there was other rules that went along with that. But anyhow, under that time frame in that system that God had set up, there were people that were appointed to take vengeance. Well, now we have our legal system set up. The Bible teaches that God has established our government and legal systems in order to provide for justice, and we see that sometimes that doesn't take place. But it's not my place to go take the vengeance. It says here in verse 17, God's going to be the judge of it. When we see people that we know are doing bad things and they're not getting brought to justice over it, and we tend to get concerned about that, and we should maybe be concerned about it, but ultimately we have to understand God's going to take care of it. God's going to be their judge. They might get away with it on this earth, but they're going to answer to God for it in judgment, and they're going to have to answer eternally for it. And so we need to understand that whatever punishment maybe that we might be able to give them on this earth is nothing compared to what God can do. So God's going to take care of it, and we don't need to get overly concerned about it. We just need to understand that God's in control. Tom, do you have something?
Just, some observations that we see. In ours, we like to think that we have a very balanced and fair judicial system, but we realize that men are appointed to those positions, and we see it sometimes. Maybe our president goes through and makes a law, or signs something in the law, or he suggests something beside the law, and the opposing groups will go around and they'll find a justice that will override it because, you know, he has a different opinion or a different interpretation of the law than what's in the law. So it's really that justice and injustice that's getting done. We see that, you know, time and time again. We see injustices with people, the way some people are dealt with things, or the way other people are dealt with things. We sort of are building a situation in this country that, well, if you're, you know, wealthy, you can get away with things, but if you're poor, you don't. And really our ideal justice system doesn't look at it that way. It's the people that we put in place and the justices that we put in there. How corrupt or how righteous are they? That's where the balance comes in.
Mm-hmm. But we need to, as Tom said, you know, with men, justice isn't always meted out because there's different opinions or different ideas of what might be just or fair or righteous. But with God, He's the ultimate standard of that, and He's going to be the fair and impartial justice. And so we need to understand that no matter what happens here, we're all going to answer to God, whether we've done well or not, and that God's going to take care of it. All right, let's start reading again in verse 18. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from the dust, and return to the dust. Who knows the spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal, which goes down to earth? So I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? So we see here Solomon's talking again, and he talks about, he's comparing things, and in this part of it, he's thinking, I think, primarily from the physical aspect. He's saying that God tests us, and that we may see that we're just like animals. And he goes on to talk here, and he says, you know, animals, they live, they go through their life cycle and die. And men, they're born, they go through their life cycle and die. And he said, we're not really any different than the animals. We breathe the same air. God has put the spirit of life into all of us, just like he did the animals. And so he's saying there's really no difference. And he's, from a physical aspect, he's saying, what's the point of everything we do? Because we're just going to grow old and die. Or somehow or another, we're going to get infirm and die. And he says the same thing happens to all. You know, both die, they both live. They all have one breath, and that man has no advantages of animals, for all is vanity. And so he's saying really the whole point of living is just uselessness. That's what he's saying from a physical outlook. And, you know, if we're thinking strictly from a physical standpoint, he's right. That would be correct. Because from I can't hardly talk this morning, I have to slow down. From a strictly physical outlook, we're not any different from the animals. The animals live, they reproduce and die. We live and reproduce and die, so what's the point? James?
That's one of the issues with evolution. If you think about too, it's a higher form of animal. And so if we think about it, if we're believing the aspect of evolution or that theory, what is the difference between us? If we're just a little bit smarter than a lion or whatever else, so we're going to die, and it's really, we're going to have to fight like them and stuff, you know, survival with this. If we want to take something, if we're stronger, we're going to have to do it. It's all the same thought. And it's really, what use is it? It's up to enjoy these things, the things that we've dominated or secured in our life. And it's really, besides that, it is vanity. That's the disappointing aspect of evolution, right? If you believe in that, it's all the same. I'm just like the monkey. I'm just like the ant. It's not in use.
Yeah. You know, if we really truly believed in evolution, if the people that believe in that really and truly believe in it, ultimately what they're saying is there's really not any right and wrong. It's just whoever's the strongest. We heard that phrase, survival of the fittest, and that's really what that would boil down to. If I'm stronger than you or more intelligent than you or something like that, then if I want your stuff, I ought to be allowed to take your stuff. If I'm superior to you and I think you ought to be dead, then I ought to be willing and able to kill you, because there's no right and wrong. It's just whoever's the strongest, whoever's the smartest. But we understand that that's not the way it is. when we look at things with that eternal spiritual aspect, we know that there's something more than that, because like in verse 21 says, who knows the spirit of the sons of men which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes to earth, goes down to the earth. We have that immortal concept in our mind, that concept of eternity that God's given us and revealed to us in His Word. So we've got something more than what the animal has. So there is a point to what we do. There is a reason for living. As we get to the end of the book here, it's going to tell us that to fear God and keep His commandments, that's the whole duty of man. We've got a reason to be here. Our reason is to bring glory and honor to God, to do things that would honor Him. And so as we think of that, we've got more point to life than what the animal does. I mean, the animal, he lives, he dies, and the next generation takes his place. But hopefully, we can live in such a way that we're passing something on. Because as we talked about last week and week before, Solomon's talking about what's the point of living and amassing a bunch of stuff, because we're just going to leave it to somebody else, and who knows whether he's going to be a fool or not. Well, as far as our physical stuff goes, there is that point. But if we'll live properly and do the things we're supposed to do, we're going to pass on to our children and other people around us values that are eternal in nature. We're going to teach them about God. We're going to teach them about being pleasing to God. We'll help to teach them about what it takes for them to go to heaven, so that they don't have to just die and their life have been wasted. We're going to give them eternal values, and we're going to help people that way. And so our life does have more to it if we're living properly and have the right attitude than just living and reproducing and dying. And so we need to keep that spiritual attitude in mind. Okay. What have I got here? Okay. As we talks about in verse 21, as it talks about, it says, who knows the spirit of the sons of men? We know that God knows the spirit of the Son. God has given us our immortal soul, our spirit that lives on. And so as far as humans go, we wouldn't really have no way of knowing about that. If we was just living in a physical world and with no spiritual nature to us at all, we wouldn't really have any way of knowing about that. But the question, who knows? God knows, and God's revealed it to us that we do have an eternal spirit. We have an eternal soul that's going to live on beyond this body. And so He's told us about it, and He's told us how to take care of that. And then in verse 22, it says, the conclusion he states here is, he says, so that I perceive that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? The question is that verse 22 similar, or is it the same as the one found in chapter 2, verse 24? In chapter 2, verse 24, it says, nothing is better for a man than he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also was from the hand of God. And I think what he's saying here is very similar, that he's looking and saying, look, a person's supposed to work. They need to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. They should, because God intends us for us to. And that's one of the things, one of the gifts He's given us. And I think the idea of that is be satisfied with what you've got. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the next chapter. But he's saying there's nothing better. Physically, there's nothing better than a man should rejoice in his own works. And spiritually, we're going to be held accountable for our own works. So our works are important here. He's teaching us a concept there. Any questions, Tom?
The last verse there, it ends in a question. Which is sort of, an asking thing for, think about this. He says there, for who will bring himself to see what will occur after? A lot of times we think about, what kind of legacy we're going to live, or what we don't have any control about. But one thing that he's questioning is, the physical things, you don't know who, if you leave it to your children, or you leave it to some organization, or whatever, you don't know really whether it's going to be done to what your full intention was or not. But if you go through and you start thinking about putting it in God's perspective, you do have, to know what will come after you. And most people don't look at that perspective. And the way we started today, he talked about eternity. And if you don't look at that concept, then that last question sort of is, you're sort of like, once you're dead, you're gone, and there's anything else to think about. Here, he sort of implying that, there is something to go through and think about to see what comes after it.
Yeah. And as we look at that verse, and it says, for who can bring him to see what will happen after him? God has revealed to us what's going to happen after us. We know He's told us what's going to happen after we leave this earth. Now, we don't necessarily know what the next generation is going to do as far as that goes, but we know that we've got an eternal soul that's going to be in one of two places. We know what's going to happen after we leave this earth. We're either going to go to heaven or we're going to go to hell. And God has been gracious to us and told us how to go to whichever one of those places we choose. If we go to heaven, it's going to be because we chose to. Or if we go to hell, it's going to be because we chose to. And you say, well, Monty, nobody in his right mind would choose to go to hell. But we do, because we choose our actions. As we were talking about earlier, we're going to be held accountable for the things we've done. We get to choose what we're going to do. There's some people that believe in the Calvinist persuasion that we're not in control of anything, we don't have any choice, that everything we do has been preordained by God. Well, if we don't have any choice and everything's preordained by God, then there's no such thing as sin. We can't violate His will. He's programmed us and we're going to do whatever it was His will. And so the Bible clearly teaches a concept of sin in violation of God's will. So ultimately we choose whether we're going to do right and we choose whether we're going to do wrong. And nobody can make you do anything. Nobody can make you do right or wrong. Now, you say, well, Monty, if they torture me bad enough and I choose poorly, they've made me do it. No, they just caused you to choose to do poorly. Nobody can physically make you do wrong. And we see examples of that. Jesus was tortured and abused terribly and then killed on a cross. But nobody made Him do that. He's done it because He chose to, because He wanted to be pleasing to God. And we see examples of other people. Stephen was the first martyr, Christian martyr that we know of. He could have chose different. He could have given in to what the mob wanted and not been stoned to death. But he chose to serve God even though it cost him his life. And we see other examples of that in the New Testament. So nobody can make us do anything. We're a product of our choices. And so if we go to heaven, it'll be because we chose to serve God faithfully. And if we go to hell, it'll be because we chose not to serve God faithfully. It's our choice. And He's revealed to us in the Scriptures what the outcome of either of those choices are. So we get to decide where we want to go. We've got two options. We get to decide and then pursue down that path for whichever one we go to. So I think we need to be constantly aware of that, is that we get to choose. Nobody's going to make us. Any other questions or comments about chapter 3? Okay. Have to turn a page. All right. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun. And look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yes, better is both he who never existed and he who has not seen the evil of the work that is done under the sun. Better is he than both. Okay, better than both is he. I kind of got ahead of myself there. So Solomon started a new thought here, and he starts out talking about oppression. The first question here was define oppression. Who can give me a definition of the word oppression? James?
Seems to be those in power, like extorting or using or abusing their power over those who have less power than them. Oppression, tyranny, those kind of words.
Okay. That's basically the same definition I looked up. It says unjust or cruel exercise of authority or power. And then, do we still see that happening in the world today? Is there still oppression in the world today? There's a great deal of it as we look around different places. And to some extent, maybe even our own country, there's oppression in the world today. There's people that abuse their power and authority to exert their will over other people in unjust ways. And so we need to understand that what he's talking about here is not any different. Human nature hasn't changed. That's just, I think, a facet of human nature, is that those with greater power tend to be oppressive to other people. And so we need to understand that that's just a fact of life. It's going to be that way. And a lot of times as we look at oppression, we think, especially when we're the one being oppressed, we think that, as it says here, there's no comforter. There's nobody to defend me. What am I supposed to do? I'm being oppressed, I'm being abused, and there's no one to defend me. And from a physical aspect, again, it may seem that way, and it may actually be that way. There's places in the world that I think, when I think of it a lot, I think of a lot of the Muslim countries, the system they have set up there. When there's somebody in a less powerful situation, there's no one to save them. I mean, that's just their nature and their government that they've got set up. There's no avenue for relief there. And so we think about that, and we think, when I don't have anybody to comfort me, and the reason being is because on the side of the oppressors there's power, but they have no comforter. It says at the end of verse 1. And so we need to understand that that's the way it's going to be sometimes. And from a physical standpoint, we can look at that and say, what's the point? Why should I keep going on living? Why should I try to do what's right? Because I'm doing it, I'm getting punished for it, and there's nobody to help me. But we have to understand, as we look at this from a spiritual aspect, that we do have someone to help us. Now, the fact that God's on our side and that God's in control and that God is the one that's going to give us relief doesn't mean that we're not going to be oppressed or abused on this earth or mistreated. Because God as I've heard it said, God hasn't promised us a rose garden. But what He has promised us is the next life. And if you think about it, it doesn't matter how long we live. If we live to be 200 years old or 969 like Methuselah, when Methuselah, it came his time to die, I don't figure he probably felt like he'd been here all that long. It probably seemed like a short time to him. Our lives seem short to us. And so since we understand that our life is short, then spend that short time of our life serving God and we'll have a better place. We'll have that relief in heaven. Bob?
A passage I thought about, and I think parallel with what you said, is in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3, it says, basically, God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in trouble with the comfort for which we ourselves are comforted by God. So, when we're oppressed, when there's afflictions, we can always look to God and help us.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned in that verse, it talks about the comfort of those who are also comforted by God. When I may be being oppressed and feeling like I've got no hope, there's people here I can turn to that can be a comfort to me, because they're people of God and they've been comforted by God and they can share that comfort with me. And then maybe when they're being oppressed, I can do that same for them. And so I think that's a wonderful thing about the system that God has set up and the church that He's established for us, and us being members of it. And we're taught to edify and exhort each other and to build each other up. When I'm having troubles, there's people here I can depend on that's going to help me. They can give me encouragement. Whatever I need, they'll take care of me. And that's a great comfort, knowing that I'm not going through life by myself. I think a lot of times we tend to think maybe we're being oppressed or whatever the deal is that's not going well with us. We tend to think we're on our own and there's nobody going to help us. And a lot of times I think we've got a certain pride or arrogance about ourselves, and we don't want to ask for help. I'm a big guy, I can take care of it myself. Well, maybe I can, maybe I can't. Probably I can't. But when we think about needing help, there's 2 or 3 or 4 places in the Scriptures that talk about when Jesus went through a particularly difficult time. One of the times I think about is after he'd spent the 40 days fasting in the wilderness and the devil had come and tempted it. Right after that, it talks about how the angels came and ministered to him. And the night before he was betrayed, I believe, if I remember correctly, it talks about he'd been in that earnest prayer and his sweat was like great drops of blood. And after that, it said the angels came and ministered to him. If Jesus, our Lord and Savior, had to have help, had to have somebody come and minister to him, who in the world am I to think that I'm not going to need help? I mean, that's really arrogant of me to think I can go through life by myself. I don't need any help when Jesus needed help. So I don't need to have no big head, or I don't have no arrogance or anything like that. I'm just a man. I'm not any superior to any other man. And if my Lord and Savior needed help, I'll need help. And I just need to accept that. Because ultimately, if we think we're going to make it through by ourselves and we think we've got everybody fooled to where they think everything's wonderful in our life, we're really the only one that's fooled. We fooled ourselves, because everybody else knows we're just regular people and we're going to have troubles and need help. So don't think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. The Bible teaches us that. Let's realize our position in life, that we're way down below wherever Jesus was, and he needed help. He needed angels to come minister to him. I need y'all to help me from time to time with my difficulties in life, and y'all are going to need help in yours too. It's just the way it is. So let's keep that in mind when we think we're being oppressed, when we think things is going really bad for us, and then we're having trouble enduring, and think, well, I can't be faithful to death like the Bible tells me to, because this is just too overwhelming. There's people to help us. God's provided us a whole church of people to help us. And not only just from this congregation, we're members here, but there's faithful congregations around the world. No matter where I'm at in the world, I can find people of God to help me. And so we need to keep that in mind. We're not in this alone. God's provided for our needs. Tom?
When you look at it, Solomon's right there, and he's going back and he's looking at things in the past. He is fully aware of the history of his people. He's not that far removed from the judges in times, and he saw the nation of Israel, as it was forming, being oppressed by those around about. When they were being oppressed, they didn't really have a comforter or something to help them. They were subject to those that had more power over them. He did, and they kept, asking the Lord to deliver them. And when he finally delivered them, the oppressor became the oppressed. And God delivered. But when that tide was reversed, those that God overcome, they didn't have anybody to comfort them. God destroyed them. So he's sort of in a perspective there, saying in one space, the oppressor doesn't have a comforter, the oppressed doesn't have a comforter, and the oppressor doesn't have a comforter. If you look at it just in the total, whoever has the power is in charge. And then he goes to go through here later on and start showing that, where is that comforter? The comforter, if he looks back at the Jewish history, was God rose up that judge to deliver his people from the oppressors. So, you got that perspective that comes in there, Solomon's going through and sharing. From his own, from a historical perspective.
And something to keep in mind also, I just thought about when things aren't going well for us and we feel like we're being oppressed, it may be a test for us. And quite often we'll ask God to relieve us from our oppression or whatever difficulty we're having in our life. And we want it done on our time frame. It's like, I want relief and I want it now. Well, as Tom just mentioned, the children of Israel, when they were being oppressed, especially under the time of the judges, they'd pray to God and they wanted relief and they wanted it then. But God allowed things to continue on in order to test them. And so we need to understand when things aren't going our way, we're being tested. And God wants to see how we're going to bear up under that test. And sometimes we know, I think it was the Amalekites, when he didn't allow the Israelites to go in and take over the land yet, they had to go to Egypt and spend that time there and everything. He said because the iniquity of the Amalekites was not yet complete. Or it may have been the Amorites, one of them A people. But anyway, he said their iniquity wasn't complete. So God had a plan in mind. Then he wasn't ready for those people to be punished yet. He wasn't allowing the Israelites to go in and punish them yet because he was giving them time to repent. And so we need to understand that. When things aren't going well for us, we need to understand that it can be a test for us. And God's wanting to see how we're going to bear up under that test. And it could be the difficulty we're going through. If we manage to go through it and come out the other end faithful the way we should be, it could be that sometime in the future, because we've gone through that, we're going to be able to help somebody else that's going through something. We'll have the experience to help them. And so it could be a training process for us in order for us to have what we need to help other people in the future. We don't know that, and it's hard to see that. The Bible tells us that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. And sometimes we don't see what the good is in something. And maybe down the road we will, but right now while we're going through it, we don't. Maybe in this life we'll never understand what the good was, but we can understand that it is for good. It's nothing else. It's a test, and it's something to strengthen us. And so we need to understand that and go with that and depend on God. And God's provided us help from others, and so it's a system that works. God's taking care of us. Any other questions or comments about this so far? Okay. In verse 2 he says, "Therefore I praise the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." Question 3 says, in verses 2 and 3, there are three categories of people mentioned. List them in the order of Solomon's preference. Well, Solomon's preference here was that he thought it was better to have never been born or never existed than to be still alive. And he thought it was better to be somebody that was already dead than to be someone that's still alive. Why would you think that he would have that attitude about it here? James?
This isn't part of the sermon that talks about the futility of life from a physical perspective only. So, if we think of that, if you've never been born at all, you're never going to see the oppression, the evil, and the futility of life, so they're better off. And then the dead, they don't have to suffer through it anymore. And the living are the only ones left. Right? And so this is the part of the sermon that's thinking from a physical only specific nature. But we know from God, when he turns around, ultimately, when he sees God in the picture, it changes. And we see that in Revelation 14, where it says, blessed are those who die for the Lord, because their works will fall out. So we know there is a blessing in death, but that's because of the benefit we have in God later on. And we can be benefited in living because we can be living for God. But at this point in time, when he's thinking about it, it's strictly physical. And that's, if you're not here ever, you don't see the bad stuff. So
That's right. As James said, a lot of times when it talks about those who never existed, he refers to those who were stillborn or who were miscarried. It's somebody that came into existence. They've got a soul because they were conceived, but then they weren't able to be born. They wasn't lived to be born. And it talks, that's the way. And so here's this person that was never able to be born. Well, he's better off than the one that's alive because he never had to go through all this difficulty. And here's the person that's already dead. Well, he's better off than the one that's alive because he's not having to go through difficulty anymore. And so he's saying you really being alive is just a miserable condition. Why would you want to do it? But as James mentioned, if we're alive, we've got the opportunity to serve and glorify and praise God. We've got the opportunity to live in such a way to be a glory and an honor to Him. And we've got the opportunity to teach other people how to do that so that they don't have to die lost. But if we're already dead, we can't do that anymore. If we were never born, we can't do that at all. And so he's saying there, from what he's saying here, he's looking at it strictly from a physical perspective of what's the point. But from a spiritual outlook, we understand what the point is. There is a great benefit to it. Tom?
You look at, a lot of psychological things that people go through. Or many times, some of us go through situations, we make statements like, boy, I wish I was never born. Or children, confront the parents. Why did you have me?
Yeah.
You didn't, I haven't done anything that's any good for you. I can never please you. Or the concept, I wish you did. Now, sometimes what happens is people go through and they play out on those things. They look at their situation in life and they say, I'd be better off dead, and they commit suicide because they have no reason for living. And it's more trying for them to continue on than to end. They look back at somebody that died and they say, oh, no, see, they're not having to go through this. And Solomon's sort of looking at that same concept. If you really put it in human perspective, sometimes we just, in our living state, we just, why am I going on? It's not really worth it. And then other times we can go by and we start putting it in proper perspective, we can see why it's worth it. We can see why, our parents brought us into this world. We can start seeing what, when we put it in perspective with God, we can see why we want to continue on. Paul made some similar things, when he was contemplating, would it be better for me to live or to die and receive my reward? And he contemplated those things too. But his decision was, well, as long as I'm here, I can continue doing what God wants me to do. And he put that perspective for us over the New Testament.
As you mentioned, Paul, in that passage he's talking about, he said, would it be better for me to live or to die? He said, would it be better for me to die and go be him personally, to die and go be with the Lord? And that would have probably been his preference. I mean, that should be our preference, is we want to go be with God. But he said it would be better for the people he was writing this letter to if he stayed around and taught Jesus and continued to serve the Lord. And so we got to keep that in mind when we think of life from a spiritual perspective. Quite often we might be in such a state that we feel like it'd be better for me to be dead. But as long as I'm alive, I can do something to serve God. I remember one of my grandmothers, before she died, she'd been basically bedridden for a long time. She couldn't hardly do anything. And she said, I'm not living, I'm not dying, I'm just here. Because that was the attitude she had. She was just here, and she wasn't being a profit to herself and anybody else. There was no benefit to herself of anybody else. But as long as we're still alive, we can do things to encourage other people and to be an inspiration to other people. Because there's other people that we've known that had got in basically the same situation as my grandmother was, but they still have the attitude of finding something to do to be in service to God. You know, they still want to go and do what God would have them to do. They're not looking at it from the attitude, I'm not doing anybody any good. But they're looking at it from the attitude, there's something I can do to serve God. You know, if we might be bedfast, we might be bedridden, but when somebody comes to visit us, we can be an encouragement to them rather than a depression to them. So we can serve God. We need to have that eternal outlook about whatever our state is, because we all know there's going to be a time when we can't do what we used to do. You know, I can't do the things I used to do. I used to be a really good runner, but I've got over that. There's a lot of physical things I used to do that I don't do anymore. But I can still serve God. I can still teach people about Jesus. I can still try to be an encouragement to other people. Tom?
Think about, we studied Job here not too long ago. And, the concept there, the advice that Job's wife gave was, curse God and die. Look at your situation. You're better off dead than you are alive. You're going through all this suffering. But Job turned around and presented her with a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to understand too, as he's mentioned in Job. Job says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Whatever we have is a blessing from God. Another place the Bible talks about we didn't have anything that wasn't given to us. In the context of what he was talking about there, I believe it was Paul, and he was talking about spiritual gifts. It's not like we was able to do all that ourselves. God gave those abilities. But at the same time, physically, it's the same way. We don't have anything that God didn't give to us. We didn't create anything. We just use what God's already blessed us with. So we need to understand everything we have is a blessing from God. And because he give it to us, we're just stewards of it, because as we've talked before, we're not going to take it with us. We're going to leave it behind to somebody. And so because we're just stewards of it, then we need to use it in a way that God would be pleased with. Whatever it is we have, whether it's our abilities, our stuff, or whatever, we need to use it in a way that would be pleasing to God. Because as it says here, as we're going to get to in one of the later chapters here, fearing God and keeping his commandments is the whole duty of man. That's what we're here for, is to fear him, to keep his commandments, to bring praise and honor and glory to him. And if we're not doing that, then as Solomon talks about in a lot of these depressing passages here, we're just wasting our time. What's the point? Any other questions or comments up to this point? Okay. We'll start reading in verse 4 and see where we get to here. We don't have but just a couple of minutes. It says, again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. I don't remember the context of the discussion that I was engaged in with some people recently, but it was talking about this idea of every skillful work. And it was talking about somebody that had done something and made a lot of money and had built themselves a big mansion up on the hill. And people was jealous of him and thought, well, if he was a Christian like he ought to be, he wouldn't have built himself a big mansion. He'd have given that money away and done this or that or whatever with it. And there's people that feel that way about it. So he'd done a good work. He'd helped a lot of people, and that's how he got to where he was. But people was envious of him. They was jealous of him. Well, it ain't fair. And I think that attitude is very pervasive in our nation today, that somebody has done well for themselves and made a lot of money, and other people think, well, that's not fair. We're going to have to take that money away from him. And that's the concept of socialism and communism that we see in the world, is that somebody may have done really well for themselves, but other people envy them and they want to take their stuff away. So that way everybody's even. Well, it's not that way, and that's what Solomon's pointing out here, that for every skillful work a man is envied by his neighbor. So that's also vanity and grasping for the wind. It's vanity and grasping for the wind in some respects for the skillful person who's able to amass this fortune or whatever he's got, because people just want to take it away from him. They're jealous, and you can't take it with you. But it's also in vanity and grasping for the wind on the person that's wanting somebody else's stuff. Ultimately, why should I want somebody else's stuff that I didn't work for? I mean, the Bible tells us we're supposed to work and earn a living for ourselves, that we might be able to share with those that are in need. So I should want to make enough financial for myself so that I can do good for other people. But why should I want somebody else's stuff just for the sake of having it, just so that we could all be even? The Bible doesn't teach that concept. It teaches us to work and do for ourselves, to earn our own living and make our own way in the world with God's blessings and God's help. And so as we think about those kind of concepts that people have, and you know, we think this idea of socialism or communism is relatively new in the world. Well, apparently it wasn't, because Solomon was talking about it here. Basically, when you do really well for yourself, somebody else is going to envy you and want to take your stuff away. Any questions or comments about that? Dale?
I think sometimes we don't give Solomon the credit. We look at him as the richest, one of the richest men in the world. But really, when you stop and think about it, the last 2 chapters where he's talking about God, you see his wisdom coming out.
Mhm.
He's not talking about money or riches or anything like that. He's talking about, there's a time for everything. There's a time for every purpose. But now he's talking about God.
Yeah.
Maybe he had a turn of events in his life and seen the wrong that he did.
Yeah.
But, sometimes we don't see that. But, like we say here, there is a purpose. But it's God's purpose.
That's right. God's got to be number one in our life. Thank you for your attention in class this morning.